Welcome to the Unlist. Today, I want to talk about vintage fragrances and whether or not they are truly better than what's currently available on the market today. Now, I know some of you out there are going to want definitions for the word vintage because vintage, as it's defined in the dictionary, has a pretty broad definition. So we need to get more specific, especially because I know there are people out there who like to debate semantics and all that stuff, or move the goalposts around so they can win arguments. The usual debate me bro types that I don't really like to treat with in the first place. So for sake of argument, we're going to say that a vintage fragrance is any fragrance that is either from a line that launched at least 20 years ago, or the bottle itself is physically 20 or more years old. So if you have a fragrance that originally released in, say, 2003, but your bottle is newer than that, you have a vintage fragrance, at least in composition, in style. If your bottle is literally from 2003 or earlier, then you get bonus points because now your bottle is physically vintage too. It's not just a vintage fragrance or a newer bottle of a vintage fragrance. But I count both of those. So if you have Polo from the late 70s, or you have Polo from the late 90s, or the Polo from the 2000s, if you have a bottle of Polo, you, in my eyes, have a vintage fragrance. It's just if you have older examples, then you have what we sometimes refer to as deep vintage, as opposed to just vintage, right? So it's a very thin line there. I know we're kind of getting pedantic, but that's the easiest way for people to understand what we're talking about. So I just need to put it out there. Now, some of you might think, oh, 20 is not old enough. It needs to be at least 30 years old or 40 years old or whatever, right? Whatever your definition of vintage is works for you. But if you're not going to accept my definition of 20 or more years, then you might want to click off this video now because you're not going to have a good time watching. For me, 20 years or older is where I start the vintage nomenclature. When a fragrance acquires the status, if you will, if it's made it to 20 years, it's vintage. So I don't go older because I look at it practically. 20 years is a long time. And if the average human lifespan is anywhere from like 75 to 85 years, then 20 years is a significant portion of that life. So let's not make things more difficult than we need to. 20 years is plenty of time. In some states in the US, 20 years is old enough for a vehicle to be considered vintage or to get antique tags, right? Or 25 on some states, depending. So there's a 5-year wiggle room there. But that's one of the reasons why I use 20 years. And for the people who want to say a static year, like, oh, nothing past 95 can be considered vintage, I kind of go, no, that doesn't make sense to me. And the reason why I say that doesn't make sense to me is if you're saying an arbitrary year is the cutoff point and time continues to march forward, whether or not you march forward along with it, what happens is anything after 95 can't be called vintage. So then here we are almost 30 years later from 95, okay? 95 will be 30 years ago in 2 more years. Isn't that old enough to be vintage? 30 years ago, okay? 30 years is a long time. It's not even a lifetime for some people. You know, they haven't even reached 30 years old yet. So again, it doesn't make sense. And then, of course, as time continues to march onward, for example, in another 10 years, 95 will be 40 years ago. In another 20 years, 95 will be 50 years ago. So if you place the goalpost of vintage as a static year and you don't allow it to roll, like you don't make it a rolling number of years, then you just continue to decrease and decrease and decrease the window of what's legitimately considered vintage. And in my eyes, that's being a gatekeeper. And you know how I feel about gatekeepers. Gatekeepers might have noble intentions, but they end up causing more problems than they solve. And it's usually, they're called gatekeepers for a reason. They want to keep as many people out as they can. They want to make something so narrowly defined that only an elite few of people can actually be a part of whatever it is that they want to have and hold and sort of be the arbiter of. It's usually some kind of power trip ego thing, or fragile psycho. I'm not getting into it, okay? So basically, 20 years for me, and for all arguments going forward that discuss vintage fragrances, for me, 20 years, rolling 20 years is the starting point for vintage. And if you disagree, that's fine. Like I said, you can just click off this video and not watch. So now the next part is, now that we have our terms defined here, is vintage really better than anything that's currently on the designer or mainstream market? So we're going to include larger niche brands and some cosmetic brands and other things that would fall under what you might find at a typical fragrance counter in a department store or standalone boutique, etc., etc. The answer is maybe. You can't really give a unilateral answer to a question like that. You can try to, if you want to just be one of those guys who thinks he knows everything and can speak for everyone, and your opinion is truth, like the judge's gavel comes down. But people like that to me are assholes. I don't treat with them either. So respectfully and realistically, the answer is only maybe, not yes or no. And the reason why I say maybe is vintage fragrances are better than what's out there in the current market today only if your values align with the values that were used to create fragrances from a certain era. Because values change over the decades. Social values, ideological systems change, political spectrums change. Human society is not a static thing. So if you value and appreciate the things that were valued and appreciated at the time when those fragrances were first released, and if that is still something you value, then yes, vintage fragrances of a given era, not all vintage fragrances, but of a given era, those, whether it's the 70s, the 80s, the 60s, whatever, those fragrances from that era will resonate with you more than what's out there now. However, the reverse is true. If you think that's old fogey stuff, if you think it's irrelevant, if you think it's dated, if you are someone who is obsessed with trend, you want to be contemporary, you want to be relevant to people around you, you have a sense of social responsibility or social proof. I'm not one of those people myself. I don't need to keep up with the Joneses, as they say. I'm not one to do that. So for me, that's not a concern. But if it is a concern for you, if you're the person who's constantly checking to see if your fragrance is still cool to wear, then vintage fragrances will not be better for you. In fact, you will look at them and scratch your head. Why does anyone still want to wear that, right? That's what you're going to say. And both of those points kind of sit at odds with each other. Someone who values things of yesteryear, someone who values the constantly changing trend, status, whatever. People of those different mindsets can't get along. They are going to be cats. Claws are going to come out. It's going to be like that, I've seen it happen in forums, guys. I already know. They usually end up hating each other's guts and blocking each other. It's just the way it goes, man. Everyone has a school of thought, and people don't really want to entertain opinions that oppose their own anymore. We all have our little echo chambers, our own little resonance boxes, our own little safe spaces that we crawl into for confirmation bias, okay? So, and especially on the internet, in person, people are a little more open to listen to what someone else has to say. But on the internet, no. We just go, you're blocked. I'm not going to listen to you. Now, my opinion, what do I think? So, I can't give you a straight answer of, are vintage fragrances actually truly better than what's out there now? I say maybe, and I say yes if this, no if that. But if you want my opinion, subjective, you can't verify it, I can't give you citations for it, all right? It's not a college thesis, all right? So if you just want my opinion is yes. I think there's a little asterisk here, I think most vintage fragrances are going to be superior to most modern mainstream releases, but only in two very specific areas. So there's a lot of asterisks here. There's a lot of caveats here, but that is my official answer to the question. In my opinion, most vintage fragrances are going to be better than most currently available mainstream releases. Mainstream releases, okay? Not niche, not artisanal, not indie, okay? But mainstream releases, most vintage fragrances are going to be better than most modern mainstream releases. So most fragrances more than 20 years old, if you want to be more pedantic, are going to be better than most releases sold at mainstream counters that are under 20 years old, for two very specific reasons. Reason one, until the last 15 years, so let's say about 2008, 2009, right after the big economic crisis and the housing bubble and everyone lost their jobs, corporations got bigger and consolidated, millionaires became billionaires, the poor got poorer, the middle class disappeared, the whole dystopian corporate hellscape that we live in if you're in a Western country, particularly the US and parts of Europe. That all really came to a head in like 2008, 2009, all right? The world changed. It was a subtle change, and I don't want to get political too much here. It was a subtle change, but the world did change. And suddenly a lot of things were no longer kept on a longer leash like they were, okay? And a lot of those things, especially artistic things, were reined in and kept on a tighter leash. You see it with the change in movies, you see it with the change in pop music, in video games, any kind of arts and entertainment segments, and now you're seeing it happen in the perfume world too. And that's where the artists and the creative directors, the people who used to have more control over the creation of perfume, are now becoming more and more beholden to the stockholders, the shareholders, the CEOs, the white-collar folks, the people up top, the marketing departments, the accountants, and just, you know, in general, the bean counters, okay? And the bean counters are now doing all the heavy lifting with the creative process. And the perfumers, the creative directors, the oil houses, they're kind of being shackled to the demands of the profit machine. And it was slowly going that way in the 80s and 90s. But once we hit that economic crisis point in the late 2000s, that's when it went like this. And it took off. People want to blame IFRA. And no, IFRA has made it more difficult, but they're not really to blame. And people also want to blame other things too. They want to blame, millennials and their avocado toast. They want to get generational. They want to get political. No. Those aren't reasons either. The real reason is just greed. Okay, it's greed. It's corporate consolidation. It's all those nasty things that we all want to pretend aren't real. Okay, we want to blame something else. But no, it's the greed. And, you know, the vintage fragrances, or I should just say mainstream fragrances, whether we're talking cheap stuff from Avon and Revlon, Prince Machiavelli, all the way up to like Dior and stuff like that, the whole swath of mainstream fragrances for the better part of the 20th century, most of the 20th century, if not all of it, and the very beginning of the 21st century, the client brands that were commissioning these fragrances would give a brief to the oil houses, give a brief to their house perfumer if they have one, and then most of the heavy lifting was done by the perfumer. The perfumer would basically get to interpret the brief however they saw fit. There was still back and forth. There were still evaluators. There was still a bit of refinement going on there, but generally the whoever won the brief, their expertise, their artistic direction would be respected by the client. Like, okay, the perfumer knows best. Let's let them do what they want to do. And that allowed for people like Germaine Cellier and for Vincent Rubert and people like Bernard Chant and Josephine Catapano. It's allowed for people like Pierre Bourdon and Jean-Claude Elena to develop their own. You know, Edmund Runitska is probably one of the biggest examples, to develop a personal style that they could then apply to their submissions for clients. That no longer exists. Now it's focus groups, consumer testing, AI, all this marketing data that predetermines before the perfumer ever gets to touch anything. Predetermines what the fragrance is going to be out, what kind of materials have to be in the fragrance, because all the testing came back and said that these are the hot things to have. Sometimes they will literally just take a gas chromatography scan of a competing fragrance and give it to the perfumer and say, this other brand released this fragrance and did really well. We want you to look at this chart and see what they did, and we want you to duplicate it and put our name on it. So yeah, creativity is at an all-time low, and it's not the perfumer's fault. They would love to do better if they were allowed to. And I've talked to some, trust me, I'm not going to mention their names. Some of them have retired. A lot of them have moved on to doing their own stuff if they haven't retired. You ever wonder why a lot of these big perfumers like Alberto Morillas have their own brands now, have their own niche sub-labels? Why Raymond Monagal left Marugia and went and did his own house? There's a reason why they're doing it. It's because they want the control back. They want to be able to play around and have fun and enjoy their job again, you know? They've done this for years, and they've watched the industry go the way it's gone, and they're just sick and tired of it. So they know that they can go do their own thing, and maybe it's lower volume. Maybe they get less money overall, but they can still make a profit and enjoy a lifestyle that they have and be happier creatively as artists. Now, the second reason why vintage fragrances are generally better than most mainstream ones we have now is the R&D budgets were higher and the time allotted. In addition to the perfumers having more control, the creative directors themselves having more say, they also had more time and more money. Now, ironically, we have more novel materials and ingredients now than ever. If the perfumers had access to all of the available synthetics that are out there, all of the available surviving remaining naturals, they could do wondrous things, but they can't due to the R&D budgets, due to the contracts that are signed, due to the exclusivity deals, and due to the time frame expected for turnaround. So a lot of times they are locked into just Givaudan materials, just Varanis materials. They're expected to make a final product ready for upscaling, manufacture, and ship, and sometimes less than a few months. They have to grind out a perfume really quick. They have no time to really work on it. They're given a very minuscule budget of materials to use, so they have to get the cost under so much, and they only have so much time. So not only are their hands tied behind their back because they're not allowed to just explore and create, but they also have to do like a McDonald's drive-through window and crank the perfume out so fast. So it's no wonder they rely on AI tools. It's no wonder they rely on a lot of this data that's fed to them by the marketing departments and stuff, because they just don't have the time to sit there and make something like a Diorella, or make something like a Halston Z14, or make something like Calvin Klein Obsession, or YSL Opium. They just don't have the time to sit there and do something like that, you know? And of course, reason number 3, but it's not really as arguable of a reason either. There's been a paradigm shift. A lot of designers and larger upscale cosmetic brands, they used to like releasing fragrances that made a statement, that said something either about the wearer or said something about the brand themselves. These days, it's purely a marketing exercise because the perfumes are no longer the entry-level product. They're not the thing that gets you into the brand. The perfumes are now the moneymaker. They are the bread and butter. They are the Wonder Bread, okay? They are the Cheese Whiz. So they are expected to sell in massive quantities, and the profit to cost margin is so optimized. And it's also why the perfumes, if they don't sell millions of bottles at launch and do extremely well, they're just killed off in a couple years. Like you see these big releases, flankers or whatever, and then they're gone in 2 years. And you're like, what happened? So they don't sit on the market like they used to for 5, 10, 15 years. Who cares if they're not the number one seller? People are still buying it. We're going to keep making it. That's no longer a thing. If it's not the best thing ever, it's gone. It is just gone. Okay, cold, heartless, ruthless. That's the market we live in. And that is not an environment where you can make highly artistic, memorable, unique, distinct fragrances, especially when your hands are tied and you don't have adequate time, don't have adequate budget, and don't have access to every color in your box of crayons, every tool in your toolkit, okay? So it's like a one-legged guy in an ass-kicking contest, told to kick as many asses as he can in like 2 seconds, and he's already hopping on one leg as it is. That's the perfume industry in the mainstream light as it is today. And in my opinion, that's why the majority of vintage fragrances are going to be better than the majority of what's out there now in the mainstream. Can miracles happen? Yes. Miracles do happen, and when they happen, I buy them. But it's a lot less likely these days, especially with the frequency and volume of new releases on the market anymore. And there you go, vintage fragrances. This has been the Unlist.